Tonight, Rishi Sunak says he can and will cut taxes. In a campaign-style speech ahead of the autumn statement on Wednesday, the Prime Minister says we've halved inflation. Is this the plan to turn the Conservatives' fortunes around? We'll be joined live from Bahrain by the former Trade Secretary, Liam Fox. Meanwhile, another extraordinary day at the COVID inquiry. Sir Patrick Vallance, the former Chief Scientific Advisor, now notable diarist, tells of a shambolic operation and a lack of leadership in government. And as Argentina elects a chainsaw-wielding president, we'll look at political props. All that and more with Guto, Harri and Ben Bradshaw, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Monday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. So there's this thing called the number 10 grid, and it works a bit like the calendar that you stick on your fridge. It's kind of like a diary where you put in your news announcements that you're making and other important stuff that's happening in the week ahead. Now, the idea is that the grid allows number 10 to control the news agenda as much as possible. So all the ministers know what they should be talking about on what day, and also you can dodge other big news events that can knock your story off the front pages. So I'm really not sure what exactly went on today, because number 10 scheduled their big speech from the Prime Minister on the same day that Sir Patrick Vallance, the former Chief Scientific Officer, was giving evidence to the COVID inquiry. So if the point of the grid is to avoid news congestion, this was a bit like getting stuck behind a tractor on an A road. You're not going anywhere fast. And guess what? The speech was duly overshadowed by the pretty explosive evidence from Patrick Vallance. I guess the thing is, I've been thinking about this, I'm not sure when else they could have done it. Tomorrow, Chris Whitty's giving evidence at the COVID inquiry, and then on Wednesday it's the autumn statement, so it's too late. And plus, they wanted to do it last week, but the Supreme Court ruling on Rwanda completely scuppered that. So I guess today is a bit of a lesson that there's only so much control of the news agenda that number 10 can really have. But don't worry, because here on the Politics Hub, we were paying perfect attention to Rishi Sunak's speech. And the headline was, now that inflation's coming down, he's going to be cutting taxes. It did feel like a campaign speech as well. You can see that tax is a key dividing line the Prime Minister wants to draw with Labour ahead of the election as well. So let's get the detail, shall we, from that speech. This is Sky's Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates.
OK, there we go. Right, we're in business.
The two men attempting to fix the British economy. It's been hard graft. The PM says that it's now starting to pay off. And just in time, he needs a good story to tell. A speech to reassure impatient critics and a warning to those who say this should be easy.
I believe in cutting taxes, but doing that responsibly is hard. And no matter how much we might want them to, history shows that tax cuts don't automatically pay for themselves. And I can't click my fingers and suddenly wish away all the reasons that taxes had to increase in the first place.
The country's tax burden is at a 70-year high. This week, that will begin to ease for some.
Now that inflation is halved and our growth is stronger, meaning revenues are higher, we can begin the next phase and turn our attention to cutting tax. It will take discipline, and we need to prioritise. But over time, we can and we will cut taxes.
Rishi Sunak wants the credit for tax cuts that'll be spelt out by the Chancellor on Wednesday. Downing Street's argument is that the economic backdrop has changed. Inflation is down, but still high. And the rest of the picture is far from rosy. Growth from July to September, 0. And debt as a share of the economy, 95.3% in January, now up to 97.8% in September.
What matters more than the economics is the politics. Rishi Sunak desperately needs to change the dial with Wednesday's autumn statement. After the confusion over his conference speech, an underwhelming King's speech, according to many on his own side, and a reshuffle that left lots of noses out of joint. This could be his government's last big set piece before Christmas. Backbench Tories tell me the Prime Minister and Chancellor need to use it to show whose side they're really on.
I think all leaders are very good at giving us a headline, and I think the devil has always been in the detail. So that's why the talk of tax cuts is welcome, but also want to make sure that actually the long-term trajectory is to this lower tax burden on all households across our nation, because if that doesn't happen, then simply people will feel the squeeze continue for longer and they'll start to look elsewhere for their vote.
That very opposition backing tax cuts too.
If there is money available, then I would like working people to keep more of their money in their pockets to spend on the things that they want to do. But I would say to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, you've had 13 years, we've got the highest tax burden in 70 years. This is too little and too late.
Jane, what do you think? Is this about right?
Tax cuts the foundation for a big rebuilding job. But will people like the finished product?
Well, Sam is here with us in the studio. Big moment for Rishi Sunak, you would think. You were in Enfield, in the audience, listening to the speech. What did it feel like in the room?
I mean, it really should have felt like a massive moment. Here was a Conservative Prime Minister standing up and telling the nation, finally, you can have the tax cuts that you have waited for through all of the pain of inflation, the pain while we wait for better growth. And I have to say, Sophie, it just didn't feel like that moment where politics stopped and we paid attention to what Rishi Sunak was saying. Now, a little bit of that to do is to do what you were just saying about it being crowded day and the grid and all the rest of it. But I think there are other bigger factors at play as well, and some of that is to do with the fact that really it isn't the case that inflation has come down so far to anywhere close to the real government target of 2%. It's 4.6%. That's a long way off. And that growth, which he said was better, is zero from July to September. So you can't really make an argument that suddenly we're in the sunny uplands and so we can start spending money again. Those sunny uplands are just not evident at the moment. And I think, therefore, it was a little bit muted. It was a little bit, perhaps, not the moment that grabbed the nation's attention.
Well, I guess they got another crack at it right on Wednesday with the autumn statement to kind of grab the attention of the nation. He's clearly talking about tax cuts and how he wants to do them. So what do you think we can expect from Wednesday?
Well, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, of course, will front the autumn statement rather than the Prime Minister. Now, way back in March, when we had the budget, they had about £6 billion of wiggle room to play with. It's called headroom. It's the amount of money you can spend. We think it's going to be a lot more this time, so a lot more options for the Chancellor. It's somewhere in the £20 to £25 billion mark. So what are they going to do? Well, yes, as the Prime Minister confirmed, there are going to be cuts to personal taxes as well as cuts to business taxes and other things. I think it's more likely that they're looking at national insurance than it is that they're looking at income tax per se. I know in the Treasury they feel that income tax, often you spend a lot of money on it, but people's pay packets don't improve markedly. Nothing, I think, on stamp duty. Nothing, interestingly, on inheritance tax, despite all of the perhaps misleading signals from the Treasury that we have got. But really difficult decisions, I think, on benefits, because there's a question of where the money comes from as well. At the moment, universal credit, which helps people who are at lower income jobs as well as those out of work, well, that goes up by whatever the inflation rate is in September. Actually, now they're looking at maybe uprating it by a lower rate, which save them billions. But is that fair on hard-working families? Actually, what Jeremy Hunt wants to do is to provide a budget that tries to neuter some of Labour's arguments because, of course, this is all facing an election fairly imminently. If you don't help the people who are in work and are doing the right thing, then what's the point of the whole thing?
OK, really interesting stuff. It does feel, doesn't it, like we are going to have some big news coming out of Wednesday's autumn statement when the Chancellor stands up to deliver that message. Perhaps not the moment that they were after today, though. Sam, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates there. Lots to talk about with our next guest on the programme tonight. That's the former Trade Secretary Liam Fox. He's in Bahrain and joins us now. Thank you very much for being on the programme. I want to talk to you about the Middle East and the reason that you're in Bahrain in a minute. But first, just to pick up on what we were just discussing with Sam Coates and the Prime Minister's speech today. Is now the right time to cut taxes, Sam?
It's always the right time to cut taxes if you can do it. But I think there's another element to the debate that wasn't touched upon there, which is not just tax and spend, but how do we generate more wealth in our economy? And I am very keen that we get taxes down, and particularly to small businesses. You know, over 82% of all the jobs in our economy are in the private sector. 69% of those private sector jobs are in small and medium businesses. So we need to give them a bit of a break. After the pandemic, many are still struggling a bit, and I hope that we can help get their tax burden down too, because ultimately they're the ones who generate the wealth and the jobs upon which all our spending in the future will depend.
Interesting to hear there, perhaps a bit of a call for something on business taxes as well in the autumn statement on Wednesday. The other thing is, in the speech today, we were given 5 new pledges to remember, in addition to the 5 pledges in January, so reducing debt, cutting tax, building domestic energy, backing business, providing a world-class education. I mean, are you guys in the Conservative Party going to need flashcards to remember all these pledges now?
I didn't see this speech today, so I wasn't aware of that. But I think it's pretty much setting out mainstream Conservative policy, isn't it? These are all things that a mainstream Conservative government would want to do with the economy, lowering the tax burden on working people. That tax burden went up a lot, not least because we had to pay for the pandemic and maintain businesses through that period. We're going to, I hope, now get a more benign economic outlook where we'll not have the shocks of the Ukraine war, not have the shocks of the pandemic, and where we can plan. And with inflation coming down, most of that headroom will be generated by the fact that the government will be paying a lot less in debt interest on our national debt. That's a big relief, and that can potentially create quite a lot of, as you say, so-called headroom.
At the same time, though, is the economic situation as good as everyone's saying? You know, inflation's still twice the Bank of England's target. Growth is effectively zero. It's flat as a pancake. It's not that much room to play with.
Well, there will be, because at 10% inflation, your debt interest is something like 106 billion. If that is halved, you get a big reduction in that. Of course, the Chancellor won't want to bank on all of that, and he'll want to, of course, keep his options open for his budget in the spring. But I think the signals that are being sent is that are that the Conservatives are a low tax party. It's not an abstract thing. We believe in low taxes because it reduces the size of government, it maximises the choices that individuals can have, and it increases the incentive for people to work hard and create wealth. That's really the difference between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party.
OK. One more question to squeeze in before I ask you about the Middle East. David Cameron took a seat in the House of Lords today. Does it look a bit, I guess, odd that, you know, you can just get a peerage just like that if the Prime Minister decides he wants you in Cabinet?
Well, it happened to Peter Mandelson, didn't it? It's happened before. It's not something that's completely out of place. In our Constitution, it's something that's allowed. Whether you think it should be allowed or not is another matter, but it is allowed, and it brings someone with enormous experience back to government. And goodness knows, international affairs are quite a challenge at the present time.
OK. You're in Bahrain. What are you up to over there?
Well, this has been the weekend of the Manama Security Dialogue, of course, completely dominated by events in the Middle East. And every session ended up back talking about Gaza. There's a huge amount of anger and a lot of angst here. Anger at the level of civilian casualties, but also anger at the way Hamas have been using civilian infrastructure to create human shields, for example, using hospitals as their base. And I think there's a feeling that something really needs to change, that the talk about a two-stage solution has been going on, a two-state solution has been going on too long. Something now needs to happen. And when something does happen, it has to do two things simultaneously. It's got to protect Israel from the sort of terrorist attack that we've had, but it's got to give the Palestinians, sooner rather than later, autonomy and self-determination. So there's a lot of talk about the way forward, and mostly in the things that can't be done. It's not acceptable for an Israeli continued occupation of Gaza. I don't think the Israelis themselves want that. In fact, because they pulled out more than a decade ago. It's not possible to see a diminution of the size of Gaza. And then, of course, there is what can be done and who will take responsibility for it. Quite a lot, interestingly, here talk about a potential British role, given Britain's history with the mandate in Palestine and Britain's good relations with Israel and so on, people, I think, feel that maybe Britain's not doing quite enough to push forward some of our own ideas.
What do you think those ideas should be that Britain could potentially push forward?
Well, I think very much that there needs to be a two-state solution, but a two-state solution that guarantees everyone's security. And then there's also the question.
Just to jump in on the two-state solution, if I can, do you think the Israelis really believe in a two-state solution?
Well, this has been something that's been discussed very widely here, that the talk is always we believe in a two-state solution. And when I was talking to a lot of representatives of Arab governments here, their view was this has gone on too long. It's time now for action. And I think there's a feeling that holding up belief in a two-state solution has, in many occasions, been a substitute for actually doing something concrete. So I think there's a frustration here on that. I think there's also frustration about the role of Iran. A lot of those I was talking about Iran funding Hamas, and a lack of clarity about Israel's military aims, because you can certainly degrade Hamas as a military entity, as a terrorist group, but the mindset of Hamas that Israel shouldn't even exist is something that is echoed very loudly in Tehran. And, it's very difficult to see how you can get a peaceful solution, how you can get a two-state solution when neither Hamas nor Iran believe that Israel should be there at all. So there are very big questions that need to be dealt with as ever. But what I have detected here is a sense of urgency that I've not known before.
There's been some talk as well about a potential Israel-Hamas hostage deal that could be done in the coming days. Did you have any sense where you are about whether that could actually happen?
Well, I think there's growing optimism that it's possible. And I think that people feel that this is a necessary first step to any political negotiated settlement that will come sometime in the future. Obviously, for the Israelis, the freeing of the hostages is absolutely key, because you simply can't accept terror groups abducting your citizens, men, women, and children. But there's also a feeling here that some of the Palestinian prisoners being held, especially longer term, is not a viable situation. So I think that everybody is looking for a way forward. I think some of the disclosures we had today of Hamas using tunnels under a hospital has horrified a lot of people. But it's also fair to say that people feel, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has admitted, Israel has not been successful in minimizing civilian casualties as it has sought to degrade the Hamas terrorist network. All in all, a pretty depressing picture.
Thank you very much. Really interesting to get that perspective. Thank you. Well, let's pick up, shall we now, with... Oops, I nearly tripped over my chair there. Let's our guest tonight, the former Downing Street Director of Communications, Guto Harri, and the former Labour Cabinet Minister, Ben Bradshaw. Good to have you both with us. We're talking to Lynn Fox about a range of things, but I guess I was keen to pick up on the Prime Minister's speech today, because it feels like that's kind of, even if it didn't feel like a big political moment in the room, he's saying that he's going to be cutting taxes. Is now the right time to be cutting taxes?
Well, back to your introduction about the grids, when you've got a big statement, the autumn statement, you actually don't sort of want to reveal too much ahead of it, traditionally. So it's quite telling that they've done this big reveal today where you kind of know what's coming, hopefully. The danger is that you're disappointed when it arrives because it's not as, shiny as you thought it was going to be. But they flagged it up. So I think this is more about not the sort of retail offer, but about the direction of travel. And the big signal that they're trying to land, understandably, is that they're in a position, which frankly nobody thought they would be, to talk about giving some money back in some form of tax cuts. So it's less about the tax cuts than the fact that a year ago, the economy was shot. We were in a terrible position. The public finances were a mess. And the idea that this government would be able to do anything vaguely positive was off the cards. And what they really want you to register tonight is all that is back on the cards. And, sunny uplands are ahead.
Well, to say we're in a better place than after Liz Truss's disastrous
it's
budget.
All relative.
Exactly. It's very relative. And as your report showed, Sophie, we still have terrible levels of debt, we have no growth. And as the IFS, the independent economic think tank, said, there's very little headroom to do tax cuts. I mean, you know, if he does them for ordinary working people, I'd welcome that. But I think, actually, I don't often agree with Liam Fox. A less inflationary way of putting more money back, if you've got some to put back, is to help struggling businesses at the moment by freezing business rates and keeping on with business rates relief. But we'll have to wait and see.
You mentioned the number 10 grid there, and there's a picture that was sent to me earlier today, which I just want to show you, because it was a kind of screen grab. At Sky News, we basically often have these kind of 4 screens on our desks to show all the different news channels and what they're showing. Now, this is at the time of the Rishi Sunak speech, and no one's covering it. I mean, how much will number 10 be paying attention to this kind of thing? You know, you used to be in there.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter in the end what's happening at a certain hour of the day. Everybody will register over the next few days, and this is a sort of warm-up act, if you like, today, so that people clock that the autumn statement is going to be significant. It's going to be a moment, not because everybody's going to go that night with a calculator, hey, I'm rich, let's book a holiday. It's not going to happen, really not going to happen. But they might just think, do you know what? The worst is behind us. That horrible time last year when we all felt really hard up, that's kind of gone. That horrible time when we were worried the government couldn't afford to do anything, that's kind of gone. This guy, a year in, has kind of helped turn things around, and things are going to get better. That's what they're trying to land, and that's not to do with what happens at a particular hour of the day.
I'm interested to know how Labour's going to respond to this, because part of this is often also political, right? He was kind of trying to set up a dividing line, if you like, with Labour on taxes. What do you make of Rachel Reeves's response?
I thought it was very good. I would add to it, I think we'd be very worried, and I think a lot of people would be outraged if, in order to fund this, they do this sleight of hand on increasing benefits, most of which, of course, is paid to people in work. If you want to encourage people who are not very well off to be in work and work more hours, you don't cut universal credit, which is one of the things that can mean between putting bread on the table for their families or not. So I think that would be a terribly bad thing to do. It would look really bad helping wealthier people, but not the working poor.
OK, well, we'll have to find out what is in the autumn statement. Not too long to go. Thanks very much for your analysis. Still to come on the Politics Hub. David Cameron is now officially Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, and he's been meeting Conservative backbenchers tonight. We'll find out how he went down. That's next.
A gloomy set of economic forecasts.
Households and businesses around the country are suffering.
We've got slower growth and yet higher inflation, so the worst of both worlds.
Where is that line going to go?
The bank predicted the UK economy would flatline.
And you begin to get a sense of how the economy is doing. Soggy.
It's a very challenging environment in the short term. Then we can be very confident of our future.
Breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. शांति से इनको समझाओ वरना ये हम लोग It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders, and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Right, it's been a busy day on our digital politics hub. You can see lots of coverage here about the kind of hinted tax cuts, of course, but also one of our main stories was this one, the COVID inquiry, hearing from Sir Patrick Vallance, who, of course, was the Chief Scientific Advisor, giving evidence, pretty bombshell session, including this bit. He says that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme would have increased the number of deaths. He also says that ministers would have understood the scientific advice well enough to know that as well. Lots more on that later as well. Plus, we've got this story. This is the Young Conservative network. So they're effectively closing down. There is a statement on social media. They say the Conservatives need to do more to appeal to the youth vote to stand a hope at the next election. They conclude, our present... Here we go, this is a statement here. Our present policy offering to them is less than inspiring, and they highlight housing, childcare and education as some of those areas lacking in ambition. Plus, have a look at this. Hearing lots today about how Rishi Sunak has been meeting one of his 5 key pledges to halve inflation. Let's see how he's getting on with some of the others, because, of course, he was talking about other issues as well. And remember, of course, inflation's still above the Bank of England 2% target. He's also got 4 other pledges too. You can see them here. Halve inflation, that's what he's doing all right on. Plus, grow the economy, reducing debt, cutting NHS waiting lists and times, and stopping the votes. And you can see here, with our pledge tracker, exactly how he's doing on some of those pledges. This is our assessment on those 5 key pledges, so do have a play at home. And if you can scan the QR code, you can catch up with all of the latest on the Hub throughout the day. Now, David Cameron was introduced in the Lords today, or should I say Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, donning the ermine to take up his job as Foreign Secretary, despite not being an MP. But not everyone in the Conservative Party is happy about the appointment and what it says about the direction of the party. So we went along to the 1922 committee meeting of Conservative backbenchers to try and win them over. Well, we can talk now to our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who is with us from Parliament's Central Lobby. John, how did it get on?
It went very well for the former Prime Minister. Certainly all those who were in the Boothroyd room over in Portcullis House loved it. I don't think I've ever heard such loud banging of desks. Now, I know that's always put on for our benefit, but he got a great reception. They came out saying he was what a class act he was. Classic, one said. Vintage, another said. He managed to steer clear of controversy. He was asked a potentially tough question about Rwanda, the Rwanda policy and possibly pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights. Well, I was told that he swerved round that in what was rather a long answer. Now, China, another issue which he's been criticised by some Conservative MPs. Ian Duncan-Smith told me after the meeting, he said, I had my hand up, but I didn't get to answer my question because the division bell went and there was a vote. Anyway, earlier, of course, he was over down this end of the building, the House of Lords, to go through the procedure whereby he formally becomes a Lord. And then he went and spoke at a food summit, a government food summit, all about aid to third world countries and so on. And he made this rather slightly odd quip where he said, I've had an extraordinary day going to the House of Lords and doing all the right things and nodding and saying the oath and all the rest of it. So I can go home and tell Mrs. Cameron she's now Lady Cameron. She's absolutely furious about that. So when he arrived at the 22, I said, what's all that about? Why is she furious? He said, oh, she doesn't like titles. But it was just like he'd never been away, really. I mean, I covered loads of those meetings when he was Prime Minister. He always used to say it was exercise book down the seat of the pants time. I don't know if that's a reference to Eton, but He looked in the room and he said, oh, it's like going back to school. He said, there's a few faces there I don't recognise. But when he arrived, there was backslapping, handshakes and so on. They came out, they'd absolutely loved it. One exception, when Theresa May arrived, there was no eye contact, no handshake, no greeting at all. Ooh. She was the one really who didn't really acknowledge him and have a friendly gesture or a friendly word for him. So I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, he's gone home now to explain to Samantha that she's now Lady Cameron.
I love that. I wish I could be a fly on the wall of that conversation. John Craig, or Sir John Craig, I should say, as he's known in the office. Thank you very much indeed. Still to come on the Politics Hub tonight. Sir Patrick Vallance tells the COVID inquiry Boris Johnson was bamboozled by graphs and struggled to understand risk during the pandemic. Hello, welcome back. Boris Johnson wanted to let COVID rip, and his most senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, believed Rishi Sunak thought it was OK to let people die, the COVID inquiry heard today. The former chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, painted a picture of a shambolic response to the crisis and said Mr Johnson was bamboozled by the graphs and data presented to him. Apparently he struggled with concepts involved, often having to have them repeatedly explained. Sky's health correspondent Ashish Joshi reports.
Rishi Sunak's hugely controversial Eat Out to Help Out scheme was introduced to save Britain's economy. But the then Chancellor's move, encouraging people to leave their homes during a pandemic and most likely driving the surge in infections, was never put to the country's chief scientific advisor.
The whole truth, nothing but the truth. I think it would have been very obvious to anyone that this was likely to cause inevitably would cause an increase in transmission risk.
Sir Patrick was tasked with leading the country's scientific response to the health crisis.
Next slide, please.
But he was faced with a Prime Minister who struggled with the data and who himself could not follow the science. Sir Patrick kept a diary at the time. In it, he says, 5 hours of meetings with the PM, looked broken, head in hands a lot. He then quotes Boris Johnson as saying, "Is it because of the great British libertarian nation we are that it spread so much? Maybe we are licked as a species. We are to get our act together."
The message that we get from these repeated entries appears to describe something, at least as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, more serious, a repeated failure to understand graphs, scientific concepts and so on.
Well, I think I'm right in saying that the Prime Minister at the time gave up science when he was 15. And I think he'd be the first to admit it wasn't his forte.
Sir Patrick told the inquiry that as it became obvious the virus was spreading faster than previously feared, he found himself increasingly isolated and left out of key decision-making meetings. He wrote, "PM meeting begins to argue for letting it, COVID, all rip, saying yes, there will be more casualties, but so be it. They've had a good innings." DC, that's Dominic Cummings, says Rishi thinks just let people die and that's okay. This all feels like a complete lack of leadership. He goes on to say, the right-wing press are culpable and we have a weak, indecisive PM. The start of the pandemic was clearly a very difficult time for Sir Patrick Vallance, faced with government leaders who were pushing back against imposing restrictions too quickly. But even later on, ahead of the next lockdown, Sir Patrick Vallance was faced with a Prime Minister who wanted to let the virus run through the general population. Sir Patrick's testimony chimes with earlier evidence presented to the inquiry that describes the chaos and ineffective leadership at the heart of government. But perhaps as the government's chief scientific advisor during a pandemic, it is all the more damning. Ashish Joshi at the COVID inquiry.
Let's pick up, shall we, with Guto and Ben. Guto, to you first. You obviously worked closely with Boris Johnson. Bamboozled by data?
I just don't recognise that at all. And I've run it past a number of people. He can get his head around just about everything. Whatever else you think of him, whatever you think of his policies, his decisions, the idea that this is not a highly intelligent, educated man who can get his head around a lot of things is ridiculous.
So why would Sir Patrick Vallance be making it up then?
Well, I hesitate to say the arrogance of the unelected. I hesitate to say somebody who is looking at one tiny piece of the jigsaw, a big jigsaw, and a very important piece of the jigsaw.
He was in those meetings
with him, wasn't he? But he was there as somebody who understood modelling of what a virus, in an unprecedented situation, might do in the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister has got to, A, answer to the electorate, B, pick up the pieces today where we spent 400 billion locking down, with all the consequences that we've touched upon tonight. There are much bigger considerations that he had to think about, and he had to weigh up lives as well as livelihoods, as well as legacy, as well as everything else. So to turn up as the expert witness and then just sort of slag off everybody else because they don't just agree with your narrow piece of the jigsaw is the only piece of the jigsaw, I'm sorry to sort of, I'm sure he's a brilliant scientist, worked with him last year, but he's not looking at the big picture. And the idea that Boris is not capable of understanding science is ludicrous.
I don't think it's necessarily so much he wasn't capable of understanding it, although Eton was never a strong point in the sciences, was it, in his day? It's just that he didn't take any notice of it. I mean, Patrick Vallance was the chief scientific advisor, and I think what you heard today was his frustration, that time after time after time, the advice that he's paid to give government independently on stuff he knows was ignored, or completely the opposite was done. I don't think we learned anything particularly new in that line about Boris Johnson, apart from the power of the right-wing press to influence his otherwise irrational decision. Worrying, I thought, was the evidence about Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which wasn't even put before Sage. The scientific advisors weren't even asked for their advice on that. As we know, that had catastrophic results in terms of extra deaths. It didn't help the economy because we went back into a much worse lockdown sooner than we otherwise would have done.
Can I get a quick thought from you both on David Cameron in the Lords? What do we make of that?
I just think it feels like the last desperate throw of the dice. I'm not sure what question is David Cameron the answer to. I mean, my only hope is that it signals a slight retreat, hopefully, from these ridiculous culture wars that some on the Tory right want to fight the next election on. But, I mean, to go back into government just because you're bored, into the House of Lords, I mean, it's desperate stuff. And it doesn't seem to have done the Tories any help in the polls at all.
There's a lot of baggage there, there's a lot of pluses, a lot of minuses, but I think it is a good thing that we find a way in our politics of harnessing the talents of people who have gone before. And this may start a sort of whole flurry of activity where, Keir Starmer brings back Tony Blair, or, I noticed Theresa May was
Lord
tweeting
Ben.
eagerly.
Well, Tony was a competent Prime Minister. I mean, Cameron, what were Cameron's successes? I can't think of any.
I think it's fascinating, but I did go to the Lords for a cheeky little drink before coming here tonight.
Oh, did you?
And there was a real
your,
frisson there. And I'm told on all sides of the House, in fact, not only told, but sensed it among people from your side of the House as well, that this brings a sort of a former, Prime Minister, an elder statesman in. It makes the Lords relevant.
It just shows how out of touch they are. if they feel a frisson because David Cameron is there.
Got to invite us for a drink here in the Lords next time, Guto.
Next time.
Thank you both very much indeed, Guto and Ben there, talking about some of those political stories. Now, the mother-in-law of Scotland's First Minister has told Sky News that the experience of being trapped in Gaza, fearing that she would die every day, has changed her life forever. Elizabeth El Nakla and her daughter Nadia, who is married to SNP leader Humza Yousaf, has been speaking exclusively to Sky's political editor, Beth Rigby.
Well, you'll probably remember Elizabeth, Humza Yousaf's mother-in-law, by that video he sent out a few weeks ago, shortly after the bombardment of Gaza began, where she said goodbye to her family and she pleaded with the international community to help the Palestinians. She was then trapped in Gaza with her husband for 4 weeks. And tonight she has given an exclusive interview to Sky News. Now, she's not a politician. She's a mother, a grandmother, a retired nurse. But the reason that she said she wanted to speak was because she wanted to give voice to those people still trapped in Gaza. She was with her daughter Nadia. We talked about being trapped, how she became free, her fears, and what she thinks should happen next. And we started off by asking her daughter Nadia about whether she thought at times she wouldn't see her mother again.
Definitely went through the waves. I was holding on to hope, and I had to give them hope as well that they would get out. But there was times, at the darkest of times, where I just imagined that I wouldn't see them again.
It must be wonderful to be home and be with Nadia and also your grandchildren, who were obviously desperately missed you. How does it feel to be home?
It still feels very surreal. I waken up in the middle of the night and I hear silence. And in the dark, and then I remember that I'm home and that I'm safe. And I feel very grateful for that. I walked down to my sister-in-law, who lives 5 minutes away, in the rain, in the dark, but feeling safe. And I think no one can understand how that makes you feel when you've been in a situation where you think that you may die.
I want to take you, if I may, to October the 7th. Nadia, let's start with you. If we go back to the morning, that terrible morning on October the 7th, you presumably started to see the news, as we all did, coming through here.
I think we woke up at 7 a.m. and Humza looked at my phone for the time and he said, "Oh, there's a lot of messages from your mum." And I said, "OK, just open them." And he started to open them, and then he started kind of stuttering, and he's like, we need to put the news on now.
So what happened, Elizabeth?
And we were just sitting having coffee, tea and having breakfast, and we could hear suddenly a loud whooshing noise, and it was really loud. And then we heard it again and again, and I looked to Sabah, which is Mohammed's mum, and I said to her, what is this? And she said, this is actually not the Israelis, this is Hamas firing rockets. And it sounded like it was coming from the back garden, but it's probably maybe 2 or 3 kilometres because sound travels. And there was footage and we were horrified. I couldn't believe it. And then when I saw people being taken, you know, I've got my mother, I'm old as well. And to see people being bundled onto like tuk-tuks and motorbikes, to me that's horrific.
Did you realise, Nadia, at that point that the repercussions that Israel wanted to defend itself, that it was going to be the beginning of potentially a long drawn-out war?
So as we saw the death toll increasing and increasing, I knew that it was going to be monumental punishment for the people of Gaza.
Hamza talked about a phone call where you phoned up and you said, you know, that you thought that your house had been targeted, that it might be bombed, and you said goodbye.
Yeah.
And you said, look after my girls.
Yeah.
So
but even in the morning after you've been the heavy jets and you had, I don't know if you've ever, well, everybody's watched Titanic and they've saw the old couple lying on the bed holding hands because it seems they can't save themselves. And you're lying in the dark and you hear the jets going over and they're so low, so scary. And you're not sleeping and you literally just hold each other's hand and you look at each other and you're saying your prayers in your head. And you think, is it my turn? And I'm not the only person. Everyone's feeling this. It's everywhere. It's such a small piece of land that everyone hears these jets and hears these bombs. And you just think, well, why shouldn't it be me? Why someone else?
what was your low point with your mum over there? What was the... when it was happening?
So the first Saturday, so a week after the 7th, we had told my mum on advice to travel to the border, and that's when they couldn't get through, and we got a call, I don't even know who it was from, to say, tell them to go back right now, it's extremely dangerous. And when that phone cut, when you said there's been an explosion and then it cut and I couldn't get through for about 10 minutes, I'd say that was the worst. We then had to travel to Aberdeen because conference was about to start. So I was crying the whole journey to Aberdeen, and I just broke down. I said to Hamza, I can't see people, I can't be here, I can't talk, I can't make eye contact because I'm going to break.
How did that moment feel when the next day you go back to the border and this time your name's on the list and you're into Egypt? How did it feel?
It didn't feel real until they processed our papers in Egypt, which took 3.5 hours. So then I knew they can't send me back, I'm safe. And you're so tired. I hadn't slept for 48 hours, I hadn't slept for nearly 3 weeks. And you're just so relieved, but you still don't believe it. It's such a relief. You can't imagine. But again, your heart is torn. I left my heart in Gaza. I didn't bring it home with me.
The government have been very clear that there can't be a ceasefire, that if there was a ceasefire now, Hamas would still have infrastructure to carry out terrorist attacks on Israel. Nadia, what would you like to see from the British government now?
A ceasefire would benefit both sides. I think the UK government has an opportunity to, and they have done in the past in the Middle East, is play a figure of peace, and to have that role as a real legitimate player for peace. While you're not calling for a ceasefire, you can't really be that legitimate voice.
Nadia, do you think in all of this, it's possible that we can get to a two-state solution where both people in Gaza, people in the West Bank and Israeli people can live in peace? Can you see a way through?
To be honest, on a personal level, my mind can't go forward. I'm stuck day by day that I don't know if my family are going to live and whether Palestine's going to exist. For me to think about what happens after the war when we're not hearing of a ceasefire, my mind can't go forward because it feels like we're being erased from the world.
And my final question to you, Elizabeth, do you think you'll be able to go back one day? Can you imagine that? Could you ever go back?
I would love to go back to Gaza, and I would love my family to be safe there. But I think there is nothing to go back to.
And you can watch Beth's interview with Elizabeth and Claire and her daughter Nadia from 9:30 tonight. That's right here on Sky News. The full interview, 9:30 tonight. Still to come on the Politics Hub. He's a chainsaw-wielding capitalist who's won a shock election victory in Argentina, promising huge spending cuts. Was it down to the chainsaw? How important are props in politics? That's up next.
John's parents brought him up to be Christian.
He was just like full of light. I had a little bit of a crush on him.
You couldn't have asked for a better young man. He reminds me of who I wanted to serve with.
He told me his plan was to go live in the middle of the jungle. It didn't sound that bad.
I thought that John would get accepted.
John's death captured the world's attention. It was a shocking story. This young American missionary killed on this remote island, driven to go there to share his faith, and the indigenous community that didn't receive him, that wanted to protect their small island. I think there was a mystery to what propelled John to go, and who is this tribe that we knew almost nothing about. They're described as uncontacted, but in fact they do have their own history. So we wanted to look behind the headlines and really try to understand how these two cultures and two people collided. I think that he was possessed of a radical faith. I think that he was an evangelical Christian. He interpreted the Scripture and the Great Commission as a call to share his faith with the world. He spent 10 years actually planning this mission. It wasn't an impulsive act, a kind of reckless suicidal act that it had been described as in some news reports. It was a place that he discovered when he was a teenager. He was 16, and he found this island, and it was the most difficult and dangerous place to go in the world as a missionary. And he decided, this is what I want to do to prove myself and to prove my faith. And he spent that 10 years preparing himself spiritually and physically. He trained his body, he trained his mind, and he had a lot of help, actually. He wasn't working alone. He was part of this big infrastructure of missionary organizations and individuals who helped sharpen him. Well, the tribe was described as a kind of unknown, mysterious tribe in those initial news reports, but it turns out they do have a history of contact and problematic contact. The islands, the Andaman chain, which is between India and Thailand, was for a period overseen by a British colonial administrator who left an extraordinary history of his relationship with the tribe. But one of the things that he had done was kidnap members of this particular tribe and take them back to his home. And I think that history of contact, of death, actually looms over the tribe and their perception of outsiders.
Oh, some great examples there. Any particular favourite props?
Hal Wilson's pipe, because that's a sort of one of my childhood. Of course, Thatcher's handbag. I mean, Johnson's hair.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure whether this Argentinian guy you're interested in because of the chainsaw or because of his hair, because it's pretty wild as well. There seems to be a theme here. Johnson, him,
Was
Trump.
it deliberate with the hair with Boris Johnson, or was it?
I know the secret of that hair.
It must be. Go on then.
So basically, showers every morning and then won't use a hairdryer. And he used to cycle to work, so he'd put a helmet on it and then cycle, and the side bits would get blown dry by the wind and the centre bit would still be wet, and then he put his hand through it. And I used to say, do not attempt this at home. This is the product of competing forces of nature.
That's amazing. It's like if you have a shower late at night and go to sleep and like one side of your hair is like really flat. I mean, you've got experience, you know, fighting in a sort of marginal sea. Any props that you've used before? Or?
Well, for me, probably my bicycle. I mean, it's not a prop, it's my only form of transport. We haven't owned a car for 30 years. But and the one thing that all of my constituents know about me is I ride a bike because they see me on it all the time. And it's not only a good way of getting around, but actually makes me visible, which I wouldn't be if I was driving in a car. So that is probably my hub and my prop, and I would recommend it to any budding MP.
There you go. Favourite props, Guto?
I don't know, but there's a serious point in the end. It's really hard to land a political message. It's really hard to say, I really care about this. I wouldn't recommend the Italian Prime Minister, whose name is essentially Melons, and she said, look at these and vote a certain way. That's right out there. But if you take a chainsaw, you're going to remember that. And you can do that with words as well. I remember Boris saying, no Kosovo-style social cleansing on my watch in London, when David Cameron wanted to bring in cuts to housing benefits. Now, if he'd have said, I think the housing benefit level proposed is a bit too high or a bit too low, everybody would have glazed over. You say that, no social cleansing on my watch, it registers, it stopped, and it was very effective. So you've got to paint sometimes in bright colours for people to clock what you're saying.
Talk about bright colours. My favourite prop, I think, was, I really remember this, when I was a political correspondent, Danny Alexander, Lib Dem in the sort of Treasury at the time during the coalition, presenting a yellow budget box, like the day before the red budget box, just to try and grab some headlines. I don't know if it was naff or brilliant.
There are bad props.
Yeah.
David Miliband with a banana.
Yeah.
Maybe change the course of British history. We might still be in the EU. You know, you might have been, that sort of the bacon sandwich with his, fratricidal brother and all that jazz.
It was a bad one, as was the Conservative whip's poisonous spider.
That's another one. We're out of time. I could go over this chat all day. Is SJ up next? See you tomorrow at 7.